But I do want to sort of take a moment here to focus really specifically on what climate change means for tribes. So tribes manage and protect and restore over 110,000 square miles of indigenous lands throughout the country. Indigenous people have demonstrated an enormous resilience and ability to have adapted to change, not just climate change, but ecological change, political change, cultural changes. And so climate change becomes an additional stressor on what is often already overstretched resources. And so we often hear in the literature that tribal communities are considered frontline communities. And we hear from folks on the ground that that is often true because they may be experiencing the climate changes more severely than in other communities, including health, cultural, economic, and other impacts that threaten their ways of life. Tribes also possess a unique cultural and traditional knowledge about those ways of life, and they can see how their practices may have been affected and changed by the climate changes already beginning. And so we also hear that tribes are uniquely vulnerable to climate change. We like to say that tribes are also uniquely resilient. And while oftentimes the location may be in a remote area or on particularly dry lands or on lands that are hinging on permafrost or erosion, the location oftentimes does mean tribes can be uniquely vulnerable, as does oftentimes the socioeconomic conditions left from a variety of generations of potential disruption to their communities and historical trauma. But along with that, we know that tribes are uniquely resilient and have overcome those millennia of disruption to their communities and have, in many cases, more resources and skills than other communities to do so, including community cohesion and just the ability to really understand their lands. We would be remiss to not really up front here talk about, it isn't just that the weather is changing and that's a hardship for these communities, it's that there's a lot for tribes. We also have to consider the impact of federal laws, treaty rights, sovereignty, and self-determination. And so, for example, displacement is a huge issue for certain tribes around the country, meaning, these are a couple examples, one in Alaska, one off of the shore of Louisiana, where communities are actually experiencing, in this case, sea level rise to the extent that displacement is a real issue for them. That's not true when you talk to most communities in most parts of the United States, that they're really being confronted with the consideration of being displaced and then having to think about things like relocation and resettlement and what that might mean in terms of tribal sovereignty and self-determination. What happens to the protections and rights that they do have for themselves in the case where they lose their lands? And how do they go through what can be a very burdensome and potentially expensive political process to become resettled? There are also, we're told from many tribes, institutional barriers to adaptation that oftentimes come from the federal laws for which there may not have been enough engagement, consultation, or consent, or that well-meaning laws are there to protect wildlife or there to protect lands or forests, but it is restricting a tribe from doing a practice that it could do to better preserve some of its ecology, its natural resources. And so some of these specific, unique climate-driven health challenges we hear about tribal communities include, I guess we want to start off by saying we're not going to lump together all tribes. We understand that each tribal community is unique and the experiences that it is having are unique. Its ability to be resilient and to adapt are unique. But there are certain patterns that we hear in some of the literature, things like climate change exacerbating disproportionate health outcomes. So for example, things like asthma rates tend to be higher in tribal communities than in other communities. And so climate change has the opportunity to exacerbate things like chronic conditions like asthma or even kidney conditions, cardiovascular conditions. We hear a lot about water and food insecurity on tribal lands, and we're going to talk a lot about that through this training. Loss of ecological health oftentimes means loss of livelihood for tribes who have maybe their livelihoods are more dependent upon natural resources. Maybe it's timber, maybe it's fish, maybe it's something else in their environment. We already said relocation may mean loss of culture, community, and rights. We know that the Arctic in general is warming at double the rate of the rest of the United States. And on top of that, for tribes, we know that there's often underfunded public health services. So all these things are making for unique climate-driven health challenges for tribes.